From VQR and the Center for Media and Citizenship, this is episode 3 of Circle of Willis, where I discuss the science and politics of sexual identity with Lisa Diamond of the University of Utah. And we'll also hear about Lisa's personal story, how she came to identify as a feminist, as a lesbian, and as a scientist, and how all of those identities have really converged on a profound body of work. Have a listen. Hey everyone, it's Jim Cohn. This is my podcast. It's called Circle of Willis. You're not going to believe this, but this episode features Lisa Diamond, professor of psychology and gender studies at the University of Utah. And we are going to talk about everything from the science and politics of sexual identity to Lisa's personal experience coming to identify as a lesbian. How about that? I feel really lucky to have had the opportunity to talk to Lisa because Lisa is both an excellent conversation partner and an internationally recognized pioneer in the scientific study of sexual identity development. And that's not too easy to pull off, that combination. Now, Lisa's sort of fearless. I don't know if she'd cop to that, but it's true. For example, one of the many things to admire about Lisa is that she sees no contradiction in having both the kind of a strong scientific and a strong political point of view. Certainly on questions of sexual identity and bonding, but on a number of other issues as well. And she in fact describes herself as a feminist scientist, which is not to say that her science is uniquely feminist in some way, but rather to sort of just assert that she's both a feminist and a scientist, and proudly so, sometimes controversially so. I mean, she's absolutely willing to let politics inform her scientific point of view, but she is equally willing to let science sort of update and inform her politics. Now, in our conversation, we talk a lot about the sample of women, this sample that she studied for years, for decades now, and how her pursuit of the sample grew out of a social commitment to bring sexual identity development into the sort of scientific light. But we also discuss how the systematic study of this sample caused her to almost completely rethink her understanding of same-sex sexuality. And I guess now is a good time to point out that if you're interested in a sort of deeper dive into this research, you should check out her award-winning 2009 book entitled Sexual Fluidity, Understanding Women's Love and Desire, a link to which you can find at circleofwillispodcast.com. And I guess while I'm at it here, you can also find a link there to a truly seminal paper that Lisa wrote for Psychological Review on the differences between romantic love and sexual attraction in the determination of sexual orientation. It's an amazing piece of work and really pretty accessible, even for non-specialists. I think you should read it. But now I've already said that Lisa spends a lot of time discussing her own sort of emerging identity as a lesbian, but in listening to the conversation again, as I did recently, just this morning, it struck me that Lisa's is really the story of multiple emerging identities. For example, it's also about the development of her political identity as a feminist, and about the development of her professional identity as a scientist. And what's fascinating to me about her story is how as each of these identities develops, they slowly sort of intertwine over time to kind of converge on her work as one of our most important psychological scientists. I think her story is instructive. The way that we develop really can inform our interests. The questions we ask, and it's probably true that we should draw from, or at the very least, sort of respect the sources of information and identity that constitute who we are as we're developing our professional lives. Lisa's story really illustrates for me how the convergence of personal and professional interests can be powerfully rewarding, not only for her, but, owing to the body of knowledge she's contributed, really for all of us. And at any rate, I'm deeply, deeply grateful that Lisa took the time with me to record this conversation. Throughout, she's thoughtful, she's funny, she's wise, and above all, I would say extremely generous in her level of self-disclosure. Now, that kind of generosity is really, it's priceless. And I'm so glad to have captured just a little bit of it to share with you here. So that said, people of the world, struggling students, colleagues, friends, perplexed adolescents everywhere, here's Lisa Diamond.
It's the most low brow, you can do it just from your bedroom.
That's what I'm shooting.
And then you can get a huge number of followers, and then it just sort of takes off.
Just does its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's why I asked you to come in and talk to me so I can get a huge number of followers.
There you go.
Yeah.
That'll work.
See? Yeah, it should. You're kind of famous. You have a Wikipedia entry.
What?
Did you know that?
No.
Yeah. I found it. I don't have a Wikipedia entry.
How
do you do that?
I had no idea.
Yeah,
now
I found
I'm sort of
it.
obsessed. Now
yeah,
I feel like
don't look at it yet because I don't want to bias you. I don't know if it's true or not.
Afraid.
I don't see if you'll
I'm
get
afraid
upset.
of what's on there.
It said you're a feminist. Is that?
I am a feminist.
Okay,
damn
good.
it.
See, that's excellent. It's accurate.
It's accurate.
What? Okay, so I guess when I think of you, I think of feminism. I also think of sexual identity, and you've sort of blown my mind with that because I really
just doing my job.
Well, part of it is that I come from a very working class background. Good people, right? Not bad people, but definitely sexist people, definitely homophobic
so do both
people.
my parents. I mean, my parents came from. My mom is from a very small town in Florida and still has a lot of latent
Just
sexism
nervous.
And racism. And my
Sure.
dad, was raised, very poor and working class. His father died when he was 16, so his mom was. So they both came from, not explicitly conservative, but kind of traditional. And I think especially my mom from the South. I mean, when we visit her relatives, it's like a different world. It's like, a much more segregated world. Yeah. And that's always a bit of a shock.
Did she go to college and things? I can't remember.
She did go to college. It's interesting. She has a background that I didn't know a lot about until I started doing interviews with her. And it sort of blew my mind because I didn't know that much about her background. And, she was in this really kind of small town where education for girls was not a big thing.
Right.
And at some point she decided that she really wanted to get out of Lakeland and go to college, but there was no money. Her piano teacher, because my mom was a pianist and she ended up becoming a piano teacher. Her piano teacher found a bunch of scholarships for her to apply to. And sent my mom on these, made tapes of her playing piano. And she got a scholarship to pay for the first year. But then she showed up at Wesleyan, Georgia. Uh-huh. And her mom was not in favor of it. She was like, this is crazy. We don't have enough money for you to, just trying to get through the first year. And she ended up being something like $200 short to register. And her piano teacher took a collection from other families in the community.
In Lakeland.
Yeah, to support my mom.
Lakeland, Florida.
College. Lakeland, Florida.
Wow. And she
my
went,
mom,
and that's in Georgia. The Wesleyan in Georgia is in Atlanta?
No.
No, where is it?
I don't remember exactly.
I
visited it once, but
really?
It's small.
It's small town?
It's small.
Like something like Athens, that kind of small?
Yeah.
Or?
And I remember at one point, because Lakeland, again, is a kind of, I remember saying to my mother at some point, I don't know how you came out of that
Lakeland,
town.
Florida. Right.
How did you know to, how did you not end up there? And Mom looked at me and she said, I was not going to stay.
So she wanted out.
She wanted out
of
and
there.
she got
Hell
out.
with
And I
this.
gained
No
so
more
much
of this.
respect for her because
that's tricky.
She became a really
I mean, when
fiery.
was that? That was like the mid 60s.
Let's see. She and my dad got married 64. So I think she got out around. She was born in 43.
43.
So she got out when she was 18.
Yeah.
But she didn't finish college because she met my dad during a summer.
Right.
Working as a waitress in New Jersey.
Wait, but what? Well, I don't know. That's a lot of story there going.
Well, she just, from one of her roommates, she was like, I need to make money over the summer or else I can't keep going to college.
And I need to go to New Jersey to make money?
Well, that was where a lot of the Catskills, like there were a lot of these sort of summer clubs for the New York.
So she got a job.
She got a job as a waitress, and that's where she met my dad at the New Jersey shore during the summer, and they knew each other for 3 months. And he proposed, and so she left college.
They did that then.
I know.
People did that then.
They did that then. And
they
that
were nuts.
kind of shocked me. And her mom totally disapproved and wouldn't go to the wedding.
Did. Wouldn't go to the wedding. Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
3 months.
Yeah.
And your dad was going to med school?
Yeah. And he had also sort of pulled himself up by his bootstraps to...
He was from New Jersey?
He was he spent his childhood in Washington Heights in New York. And then they moved to New Jersey.
Sort of on the northern part of Manhattan.
And then went to Rutgers for undergrad.
Yeah.
And
in Newark?
Pardon?
In Newark?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they both had these really hard scrabble backgrounds and were both really and so then they end up in Los Angeles, which is like for someone raised in the winters of New York. For my dad, it was like, this sounds good.
It does, I bet. I mean, you're a physician in the early 70s in Los Angeles.
Warm weather.
It's warm.
And he went
sunny
to
all the time.
Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, which at that time was really becoming like a rising star for cardiovascular medicine, which was what, he ended up doing. So it was one of those, right place, right time.
And that's where you spring forth out of the void. Mm-hmm. Los Angeles. So you're an LA girl. I
was born in LA.
Yeah. And raised. And
how
did it affect you?
I really was not crazy about LA. So I don't know how it affected me. And it's funny because as I got older, and especially when I went to college in Chicago, people would say to me, "You don't seem like you're from LA. You seem like an East Coast person." And everyone has always told me that I seem like I'm from New York.
Yeah, you do have a New Yorky kind of
and
vibe.
I don't. Who knows?
But LA, LA can have a similar kind of vibe. It seems to me sometimes. It depends on what part. LA is very diverse.
Yeah.
But there are parts of LA that have that sort of arty, cultural interest.
And I did a lot of theater. I mean, because it's LA.
Yeah.
Like I was into acting at a very young age, and I tried to do it, because the bad thing about being raised in LA, if you're into theater at all, is like if you show any aptitude for anything theatrical, then everyone's like, "Oh, well, you should try and get an agent and start to do commercials and blah 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 blah
right,
blah."
Right,
and that's actually really hard to do. If you really want to do that, it's like a full-time job.
Yeah.
And so, like, I was going to an acting school where everybody else in my acting classes was like doing professional stuff. There was like people who ended up being like famous in my. I think Steven Dorff was like in one of my classes, and
wasn't he like a action guy or something?
Yeah, he did some like big movie, and I was like, oh my god. But that like I was not, I was never successful at that. I never managed to get an agent or do anything, and so I felt like I was just into doing plays, but it's hard in LA to just want to do that because everyone's trying to get you to like do some toothpaste commercial, and that was not my thing.
That wasn't your thing. What was your? I mean, did you identify as sort of feminist early on, or was
not
it
until
sort of politically
later in high school?
High school. Well, high school sort of like. I mean, I think about. If you're gonna get that way, it's not gonna be before high school. Really.
Betty Friedan, because I went to an all-girls high school.
Is that how you pronounce it, Friedan?
Yeah.
I thought it was Frieden for some reason. All my whole life, my mind is blown all of a sudden.
And she came to talk at my high school. I think when I was in like 9th grade, maybe.
Ninth?
I didn't even know who she was.
Betty Friedan goes to your high school.
Yeah.
In the 9th grade.
When I was in the 9th grade, and she was an old curmudgeon, at that
high
point.
School.
But it was kind of controversial because, this was an all-girls school. It was, there were a lot of sort of society girls there, and a lot of them thought that feminism was just like not for them. So it was very controversial, and I remember hearing people debate, like whether it was a good idea that Betty Friedan was coming, and I was like, I don't even know.
This is what, like 1985?
This would have been, I guess 1985.
Yeah.
And she just said, what? This is what feminism is. If you think that you should be able to make your own decision about whether you want a job or whether you have a family or whether you do both, if you just think that should be your own decision to make,
and that seemed pretty
welcome
obvious
to feminism.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, really? And
why? Because you hadn't entertained that. One of the things that I thought, I remember I remember first learning about feminism, and one of the things that I think that struck me when I was first experiencing that was I hadn't thought about the fact that those things weren't true until someone was telling me that ought to be true.
Yeah.
Like it didn't, I was sort of, not that I didn't see sexism happening, but I hadn't really reflected upon it.
Yeah, I don't have a clear memory of what I thought before that. I just hadn't, I think maybe it was just, again, right person, right time. My brain was sort of ready for it.
Yep.
And my closest friends, my very best friend who I've known since I was 5, is a woman named Janice Kim. And she was a Korean child of immigrants. Her parents basically came over here, had her, and she didn't speak any English. And that she went through kindergarten twice just to learn English. Then we met, in elementary school, and she was always really influential because she knew from a very early age, and again, it was this sort of classic Korean immigrant experience of, I need to succeed for my parents because I'm going to support them. She was an only child.
She's going to make the change.
So even at that age, she was like thinking about her future and thinking about, career. And so because she was so career focused, she was like, that was an amazing speech. That is awesome. Like, feminism is awesome. And so she sort of helped to articulate for me, So a part of it was hearing Betty Friedan. Part of it was having a group of friends that were like, well, hell yeah.
Yeah.
Hello.
And you were in an all-girls for private school?
Yeah.
Boarding school?
Yeah. No, not boarding school.
Not boarding
school.
Private school. So that probably helped a bit too.
Yeah. I thought it was great because there wasn't, all this attention on how you looked. We had uniforms.
Right.
You just showed up for class wearing your uniform with your hair all crazy, and it wasn't this. When I see television series where you see people at high school and there's like, it's basically a meat market.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like that at all.
So you went to the University of Chicago, right? For undergrad? Mm-hmm. You must have been a really good student.
I was a very good student.
Holy crap.
But my dad was really disappointed that I didn't want to go to, Harvard or Yale or Princeton.
Really?
Because he had in his mind, I think he was really proud of me, but he had a certain, University of Chicago is sort of lower on the radar. And so
you don't think about it.
Figured
it's
out.
It's not as much a part of the popular, but they take that as a badge of honor, right?
Exactly.
It's where fun goes to die,
exactly.
right? That's the slogan.
And that was, because I was not like a social, kind of kid. So, but I think once I was there, he, I think he understood the reputation of
Oh
the
my
school,
God,
and
it's an incredible reputation.
It's an amazing. Well, I mean, I think in some ways it has more of a reputation as a place for graduate study than undergrad.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
And at that time, the ratio of graduate students, there were 2 graduate students for every undergrad student. So there were a lot of graduate students.
So that gave you a lot of exposure to graduate school as well, probably.
Somewhat, although, it was always like a big mystery. Well, but the thing was funny, because I did a lot of theater and I did a lot of music. And I was always meeting first or second year graduate students. Because, as we all know, after the first or second year, you're really working hard, so you just kind of disappear.
Yeah.
And so I was like, how long does graduate school take? Because the only graduate students I've ever met.
It takes 2 years.
All right, and like they disappear. It's like, poof, they're gone. I met the first years and the second years, and then it's like they go underground.
Well, so what'd you do at the University of Chicago? Were you a psych major?
I was a psych major.
Okay.
Sort of by accident.
By accident?
Because
me too, actually. I didn't plan on it.
had my roommate was my very best friend, and also I was completely in love with her. And
how'd that go?
We were it never turned
Nothing
out
happened.
into anything. But if it wasn't for her,
but
I would never.
By this time, are you fully identifying as a
no
lesbian
way.
person?
At that point, I viewed the way I dealt with my sexuality in high school was I believed that I was just not a sexual person, and I apparently my friend, I've forgotten this. I announced to my friends in 10th grade that I was never planning to get married or have any relationships.
Wow.
And they were like, oh, okay, all right. But then I did.
Yeah, they're like, what's the content? Why does this come up?
I don't even remember. But I think around my junior year, I'd gotten involved with some community theater. And one of the people who was involved in that group ended up being my sort of first major boyfriend, and it was perfect because we started becoming close friends, and then he left to go to college in Berkeley, so it was perfect, right? Because he was gone, and so we just wrote letters, and that was perfect for me.
Great way to have
because he was smart and funny, and he was so smart, and really intellectually challenging. But he was gone.
He was gone. Thank God.
So that worked out, pretty well.
Yeah.
And then he went to England, which was even better.
You went to England?
No, he did.
Oh, he did. Yeah, that's even further away.
Even better.
Yeah, can't fool around.
And so I didn't really spend that much time trying to understand my sexuality at that point. But
you were sort of in love with your roommate.
Well, that was in high school. Was before, so high school boyfriend was the one that was in England.
Oh, I see.
But I was also in love with my best friend in high school, who. It was like a really intense emotional relationship.
Yeah.
So I was able to sort of explain that to myself as we're just, no one understands.
Right. We have an intent. But, that's
intense.
Also a thing, I think.
Of course.
I mean,
it totally is a thing.
Yeah.
I remember, there was this dicey period in junior year where we were all in the AP English class, and we were reading Mrs. Dalloway. Which is like this famous, lesbian novel.
Very important.
But
book.
we just interpreted it as like a version of our friendship.
And
we were like, oh my God, this is the first novel that understands our relationship. And the other people in the class are kind of like,
yeah. Yeah.
So I never actually actively questioned my sexuality in high school. I had alternative explanations, I guess it was a scientific part of me, for everything. Like, I had this boyfriend. You
were smart. You were really capable of rationalizing everything. It's clever people do that.
Absolutely.
They're very good at that.
And it wasn't until I went to college and just immediately was just so struck by my roommate. And it was also so obvious to me at that point that my feelings for her were erotic and not just emotional.
That takes it up a level.
Yeah.
That's a different level.
And so that's when sort of the shit hit the fan. Before then, I was not worried about it. I was just like, I'm just not a sexual person. I just don't enjoy sex with men, and that's no big deal.
So was your mind blown open, or did it seem like
it was pretty blown open?
This is understandable, or this was inexorable, or this is deeply
it was
part of my identity,
open,
or what?
And I remember walking around the streets of Chicago thinking, like, what am I going to do? And I couldn't even imagine telling my parents. I just remember thinking, there is no solution to this. There's no way that this is going to work. And now it's like my life is so completely fine that I find it really instructive for me to remind myself of that, because I think sometimes the queer community can be really unforgiving of folks who take a long time to come out.
Is that true?
Yeah. And so I have to remember my really freaked out, 18-year-old self. And I have to consciously remember that feeling of fear.
Well, it also reminds me of the It Gets Better campaign, that whole thing that seemed like a very important message that time is part of this, that the time marches on and things change over time. And it can be hard to see the how things are improving when you're in it.
And also, the thing that I find frustrating now is that, if you're living in a big urban center, things are great. But there's a lot of, queer folks living in Lakeland and Nebraska.
Yep.
And I think the media is like, oh, wow, it's cool to be gay now. And I'm like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Not for some person.
Oh, my God.
In rural Michigan, it's not.
Yeah. Oh,
the internet
totally
has changed everything. I can't imagine. I probably would have come out so much earlier if the internet had existed.
Yeah.
With it just, I remember walking to the areas where I knew what the gay newspaper in Chicago was, and I would go and I would get it and I would bring it home and I would read it cover to cover, and then I would rip it up into pieces and take it to a distant trash can to throw it away so that my roommates
just
did not
couldn't
know.
Find out. Wow, how about that? Yeah, I remember, going to high school in Spokane, Washington, which is a really conservative place, really very conservative, and then moving to Seattle and being, what
is happening
in the hell? But my early explanation was that gay people are from big cities, and really it was only really driven home when I
grew
moved
up in LA. Like, I could have actually there's a huge gay community in LA, but I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And also, when I was growing up, you didn't think about gay as meaning lesbians. You thought of gay as being gay men.
Yeah.
That time in the 80s, there wasn't as much visibility about women as there was about men. So I just thought of West Hollywood as gay men, not any women.
Yeah, on your mental map of the world. Yeah, well, and it's important for all of us. You were saying that if the internet had existed then, that things might have unfolded differently. I think that's really true. People don't realize even by the 80s and 90s, it's still pretty fraught. I remember going to Seattle and trying to find a roommate, and I found a roommate, nice guy. We're talking about, and I learned he was gay, and I said, "Yeah, I'm not going to be your roommate." This was me. I'm a nice guy. I'm a nice guy that wanted to do the right thing. But when
I was, one of the things that I have such deep shame about is when I fell in with the community theater crowd when I was around in 10th grade. And so I was clueless then. I thought my intense, best friendship was purely platonic.
Yeah.
And this community theater group was run by 4 openly gay men, all but one of which died of AIDS. And at that time, the guy who was in charge was infected at that point and actually had active AIDS, and I didn't know it. But at some point, like, I remember when I first got involved with them, I remember making some anti-gay AIDS joke just out of ignorance. And not realizing, and like, I remember
it was just
the other
what people did.
Yeah, and other
right?
folks were like looking at me, and then someone was like, "Do you realize like all the people in charge are gay men, and one of them does in fact have AIDS?" And I was like,
Oops.
and I think, oh my God, here I am, like little Miss like lesbian poster child, but in 10th grade, I was as ignorant as they came.
Yeah.
I was as ignorant as everyone around me, and I think it just shows that stuff is in the culture.
Yeah. It's implicit.
It's implicit.
It's part of,
it's
it's
all
part of the
around
water
you.
we're swimming in.
It's all around you.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you realize you sort of come to terms with your emerging sexuality
In college.
What do you do about it?
I ended up, there wasn't a lot going on campus. So I ended up getting involved with the National Organization for Women chapter in Chicago.
Yeah.
There was a big chapter in Chicago.
Yeah.
So I just started showing up to volunteer, and I ended up on the board of directors,
As an undergrad?
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Well, because,
How'd that happen?
Well, I came to realize, soon after volunteering that there are a lot of folks who come and go, and there are a lot of folks who are not that committed. So when someone shows up and they're committed, they like grab them. They're like, okay, you're not flaky. We need non-flaky people.
Sure.
And so that was really great because I was just, at that point, I was deciding what I wanted to do with my life. And I'm like, do I want to do activism or do I want to do academia? So a lot of the work that I did with Chicago Now was me trying to figure out what I wanted to do. At that time, there was a lot of activism around the abortion issue going on because that was right before the big Casey decision. Yeah. So I got trained in clinic defense because this was a time that which the anti-abortion activists were trying to shut down the clinics. So there was a whole all-day training where you learned how to physically protect women, how to link arms, how to get women in and out of the clinics. So we did a lot of clinic defense. We did a lot of, policy activism.
This is all early 90s?
Yeah, around 91,
92.
91, 92.
Yeah.
And that was amazing. And that was where I met my first lesbian lover. Who was 16 years older than I was.
Yeah.
Which is not that uncommon, I think.
No, it's not that uncommon.
I mean, she was pretty freaked out about I'm like spoiling you, and I'm like, I'm a willing partner. It's okay.
Because you're what? How old are you at that point?
At that point, I was 19.
19. Well, so you start to really experience. Did you talk to your parents? What happened?
I did. It did not go great.
It did not go great.
My mom was okay, mainly because I was crying.
Yeah.
And she, I think, turned out to sort of be freaking out on the inside, but she did a good job of being like, I love you, I just want you to be happy. My father did not believe me. He thought that it was a political act, and he said because he was a bit upset that I was like becoming this feminist activist,
National Organization for Women.
So he was like,
they're just putting ideas in your head.
You don't have to be a zealot. At some point he called me a zealot, and I'm like, it's not really a zealot thing. So that was not great. But my sister, who I'm so close to, was great. And apparently what happened is she sort of sat my parents down, gave them a talking to, and was like, you know what?
This is your older sister?
Yeah. It was like, whatever you guys are dealing with, she's 2.5 years older. Okay. Whatever you're dealing with, you need to not burden Lisa with this.
Yeah,
so go ahead,
advice.
Go to therapy, go to PFLAG, work out what you need to work out, but do not share your bad feelings with her. Go ahead.
Pretty wise.
It is pretty
That's wise.
So yeah. I was like, afterwards, I'm like, wow, I guess, I was a little rocky, but everything went okay. And I found out that, like, they actually were struggling
thrown into
quite
turmoil.
A bit.
Wow.
But they kept it to themselves.
Yeah. That's what parents need to do that sometimes. Need to work it out by themselves. They need to deal with that.
Yeah. They did not like my first lover. She was really butch, and I think that freaked them out.
Yeah, that's a little freaky.
So I think that was part of it. Was they were like, wah. You know, so, and then I went when I went to grad school, I met my current wife like right away. Like,
and that was that was at Cornell?
That was at Cornell.
So you got your undergraduate degree in psychology.
Yeah.
What, in 90?
Oh, and that was the other thing. So the reason I got it in psychology is because my roommate in college, who I was totally in love with, I was gonna.
Oh yeah, we
yeah,
left
that's
that
how
thread.
we got sidetracked.
Yeah.
So I was going to major in anthropology because Chicago's got amazing anthropology.
I know.
So all the courses that I really liked were in anthropology, and then she announced that she was going to major in anthropology, and I thought it would be bad for our friendship if we had the same major. I thought that would make us competitive. So I'm like, okay, then I'll switch to psychology so that we don't have the same major.
You're kidding.
And that's why I became a psychologist. And then she ended up switching to psychology too. So all of that was for
what
naught.
a pain in the ass.
Yeah. So if I had not been in love with her, I might have been an anthropologist.
Well, anthropology lost out.
Yeah. There you go.
So why did you decide?
Kind of at that time,
it wasn't like what it is now.
Like there were boring classes. Like I'm not even sure. I don't know. It was weird. It just shows how random these things are.
But so how did you decide to? Did you apply widely to grad school, or did you?
I
Cornell
did figure
really
out because I took a year off between graduation and grad school, so I didn't feel panicked yet, and I knew that I needed to find like a topic to study.
Yeah.
And because I was a newly out person, I spent a lot of time in the bookstore, like reading all the books about gay people.
Sure.
And I discovered a book written by one of the faculty at Chicago, Gilbert Hurt, called Children of Horizons. And it was about the adolescent gay youth group in Chicago called the Horizons Project. And that was a time that the gay youth groups did not exist, really. It was just not on people's radar that you could be a gay teen. So this was a revolutionary kind of book. And I was like, oh my God, like, this is what I want to do. Like, this is new. It's interesting. Like, I don't see a lot of women in these stories. And so that I hooked on that. I was like, okay, that's going to be the thing that I apply to graduate school to do. I want to do stuff on gay youth with a focus on women.
That sound wow.
Because no one was doing it.
That really lit your fire, as they say.
Yeah. And so then it was hard because there were only 2 places that had faculty who were doing gay stuff, right? This was a time that
2 places.
Yeah. And University of Chicago was one of them because Gilbert Hurt was there.
Right.
And Rich Seven Williams at Cornell.
Cornell, yeah,
and
sure.
So everywhere else I applied were folks that had stuff doing adolescence, but they didn't have stuff doing like University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And it was just basically for me the decision was: do I want to have to educate my own advisor about gay stuff, or do I want to go to a place with someone who already kind of knows the landscape?
And thinking about your activism, being involved with now, and your sort of activism with regard to your emerging identity, how did the science fit with that? I mean, did science seem very compatible with that, or was there any tension
so.
there?
I mean,
sometimes I think that there's tension around those kinds of advocacy.
I grew up in my father was an academic.
Yeah.
He was an academic cardiologist, and starting from when I was like 12 or 13, he would actually give me his journal articles to edit and review, which I didn't. I was like, what? I didn't even understand what journal articles were.
He was a cardiologist?
He was a cardiologist. But he basically did a whole lot of work on applying Bayesian statistical methods to the prediction of cardiovascular disease.
Shit, that's pretty advanced.
It was very advanced. And, not just because my father, I'll toot his horn, he sort of revolutionized the field of predictive cardiology.
Wow.
So, but his papers were really statistical and theoretical, and I couldn't understand them.
Like, why am I editing this?
Yeah,
why am I
and I'd be like, I have no idea. I don't know what a receiver operating characteristic is, Dad. I don't know. I can't read it. But he could tell that I had an aptitude for writing and for science, and he wanted to encourage that. So he wanted me to go into academia. He loved that side of me, and that was a part of our connection. So I think a part of me wanted to please him and wanted to be a scientist. And when I discovered that there was sort of a field of scientific research on queer people, it was like, oh,
that's me.
I can do both. I
can
do something that satisfies the activist side of me, but it can also be grounded in science, because this is a legitimately understudied phenomenon.
Yep. Knowledge is good.
I think that's
knowledge is good.
That's
knowledge
what
will
and
help.
also, when you're a smart kid and you go to college, you don't really know what to do. Like, I didn't really know what jobs were out there.
Yeah.
In the year between graduating and going to grad school, I was working at the University of Chicago's basically rape crisis center, and that was just really kind of frustrating and didn't feel very helpful, because there was like a gang rape that was not being dealt with very effectively by the administration. So I felt like, wow, I'm not really able to do anything, of value. Like, here I am, this activist, and I'm failing at, advocacy and activism. I think I'll go back to the safe world of books and deep thoughts.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So you get to Cornell. Do you meet Judy right away?
I met Judy within like 2 weeks.
Holy crap.
Yep.
That's, wow.
Yeah,
that settled that.
Wasted no time.
Good, I guess. I mean, I don't know.
And it was interesting. At that time, people did not go to graduate school to work on gay stuff. It was, most of the...
I mean, it would have been very specialized.
Well, it was not even that. It was just stigmatized. It wasn't
was
really...
it stigmatized?
It's hard to remember now how dangerous it was. And Rich Seven Williams, my advisor, ended up telling me that when my application came in, he had been about to retire early, because since he had, he was a full professor, and he had shifted to doing work on, queer youth, and basically people stopped applying to work with him. No graduate students wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Wow.
So he was like, well, if this is the way, and he had gotten a respecialization in clinical, so he had started seeing, he was doing research, but he was also seeing clients. And he was thinking, I can
apply my knowledge and skills in a different way.
Yeah, and he was like, I think I'm just going to leave the whole academic thing behind. And then he said, like, I was in that thought process, and your application came in. And I was like, wow, a graduate student is willing to actually do gay research? Like, wow. And so he's like, okay, I'll try this out a little longer. And then he ended up, he just recently retired. So he ended up, staying and doing like some amazing work over the past 20 years. And
so
I always say to him, I'm like, I saved your career.
Yeah, well, you saved it for all of us.
Because it really was that uncommon. And because it was a small niche, I felt really isolated from the other graduate students.
Yeah.
Because I would go to the big conferences like Society for Research on Child Development and APS, and there wasn't anything going on with regard to sexual orientation or LGBT issues. And so I just felt like I'm doing something that no one else cares about. And, when you go to these conferences, you see all these hardworking graduate students wearing little suits and carrying their posters, and they know exactly who to talk to. They're like already angling for the jobs they're going to get or the postdocs. And I just felt like it was very intimidating. And I just felt like I'm not a part of that world at all, because the work I'm doing, no one's going to hire. Like, I'm just not a part of this world. And I came close to quitting, several times, because I would go to these conferences and I found it so demoralizing. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to succeed at this.
Well, it's really funny, or maybe not fun. Maybe this isn't funny. Maybe this is more saddish. But I didn't identify. I mean, when I thought about Lisa Diamond and Lisa Diamond's work, I thought about attachment. And attachment and bonding, and attachment and health, and so I didn't think about sexuality until I'd known you for a while.
What's interesting
longer.
is that I found that, like, because I started doing the attachment stuff, there's sort of like I have two sets of colleagues. Some know a lot about the attachment stuff I do and like had no idea about the sexuality stuff. Some know about the sexuality stuff and have no idea about the attachment stuff. So I always felt like in some ways I had these like dual sets of colleagues that didn't necessarily, interact with each other. But one of the reasons that when I got to know Cindy Hazan and started doing the attachment stuff, I was so passionate about it. But I remember Rich was like, well, it's really good that you're interested in this because you need something more mainstream.
Right.
You need something other
funny?
than the gay stuff.
Isn't that so interesting?
And I'm glad that you actually are interested in this and that you're not just doing
Right.
because you need it. But the truth is that you do need it.
Well, and there's also a very important way in which we need to understand attachment processes in sexuality, right?
Yeah, and at that time there still wasn't a lot of crosstalk for that.
Well, hardly any exists to this day.
I believe that I would not have gotten the job at Utah if I had only been doing the gay stuff. I think it was the fact that I was doing both. Because I was hired in a joint appointment position. I'm a joint appointment with gender studies. So the psychology folks really liked the attachment stuff. The gender studies program really liked the queer stuff.
Were you jointly hired right from the beginning?
Right from the beginning. The position was a joint appointment.
Wow.
And
that's pretty. I mean, University of Utah.
I
right?
know.
You think about going from the frying pan into the fire.
I was so doubtful, and so was Judy. Who had
where's she from?
She's actually from Los Angeles as well.
Okay,
but we met.
So you meet in Cornell.
But it's
strange.
worked out well because it makes the holidays easier. And she had gotten her master's in history and then decided she didn't want to do academia, so she was still kind of casting about for what she wanted to do.
And she's like, Utah? Really?
Exactly.
Salt Lake City?
Exactly.
This is our destiny?
She was very doubtful about it.
I would be too.
She had done all this research. She's like, there's only one job there that I can imagine wanting, but she got it.
That's good.
And then her career ended up really taking off, and so it ended up being a good fit, and I literally cannot believe that I've been there for 17 years.
17 years.
It's like, what happened?
Yeah.
I truly, but it's an amazing place. You talk about like queer migration. Every gay person in the state of Utah, and some of them from Idaho, come and live in Salt Lake City.
Because Salt Lake City is a refuge or sort of a regional refuge. Most regions have one or two of those. Tucson is sort of like that in Arizona.
We ended up on the list of like one of the top 10 gay places to live, like in America. So
really,
there's a huge queer community there, and it's totally. And of course, working at the university, everybody at the university is from someplace else.
Yeah,
they're all completely progressive.
Yeah,
and it's been totally awesome to work there. So
where has your research? I mean, so now when I think of Lisa Diamond, predominant. I mean, I think about your certain attachment papers that I always cite and talk about with my students. Sort of a regulatory system that attachment brings and bonding creates. But what I really think of these days is this concept of sexual fluidity. Which was one of the things that really surprised me. I mean, by that time, though, by the time I'm getting surprised by this work, I'm enlightened. I'm fully enlightened about sex. I'm like I'm good with everything. I'm down. Some of my best friends are the gays. Whatever.
Then it's like,
and then
what are the gays?
Wait a minute. What? Yeah, right,
Who
exactly.
are the gays?
Exactly. Then the ground under even my progressive feet starts becoming very uncertain. When I think about the idea that people change, and I started. I mean, I think I sort of responded not negatively at first to that. I mean, because I'm not opposed to this in any way.
Well,
but I was sort of surprised
for a while. What seemed to be the progressive opinion is like, I know gays are born that way. It's not a choice. Like, it's a very sort of ethnic model.
Well,
of
and even among
gayness.
the people that I knew who
Absolutely.
were gay all my adult life, I've often felt that even within the sort of queer community, there's a kind of outsider status to bisexuality, for example, and people have talked about that a little bit. I don't really understand it, at a visceral level, but I understand it at a conceptual one.
I think a lot of minority communities have a lot of boundary policing that goes on.
Yeah.
I think it's true for, ethnicity. It's true for religion. There's always a lot of boundary policing. I think that's a part of any marginalized group's coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Are you in or are you out? And, and so I think that's where that sort of came from. But I think some of the fervor around the boundary policing is energized by the very fact that those boundaries are permeable and everyone knows it. And that's why it makes it so scary.
It uncomfortable.
Makes
right?
it uncomfortable.
Anything that's uncomfortable, we just want to make that go away.
Yeah.
So tell me about this sample that
this
led
was
you to these conclusions.
This was just
the
most terribly organized master's thesis project in the history.
It goes back to your master's.
Yeah. So I land at Cornell, and Rich didn't have any existing samples most graduate students go and their advisor has a research project that they start working on.
Yeah.
Well, Rich, didn't, because he was thinking about leaving it,
right.
So he didn't have any data for me to work with. And he's like, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, all of these studies of sexual identity development are on men. And largely it was because samples were recruited by just going to like community groups.
Right.
And, those groups always drew more men than women.
That's so interesting.
And so I only found like one study that had any women in it, and it was like 10 women or something. And I was like, wow, okay, I'm supposed to find a topic that no one's doing. And like that will be my thing. Like, where are women's voices? Where are women's experiences?
Yeah.
I was like, Rich, I just want to interview a bunch of women and like see what their process of identity development is. And he was like, okay. And I've joked with him since then. I've been like, okay. How could you let me do this crazy project? Like, why weren't you forcing me to have like more clear? And he's like, well, I think you did okay.
Yeah.
So like, obviously it was not such a disaster. But
he's going to love that characterization.
I did not have a lot of clear ideas about what I wanted to do. I just knew I wanted to interview women and just sort of, get...
But how did you... So you just came up with your own line of questioning, like oral history interviews or what?
Yeah. I just looked at I looked at the very small literature.
Were they all open-ended questions?
They were... Oh, no, I had... they were pretty open-ended.
You did questionnaires.
I had questions.
Did you do like attachment scales and things
like
that?
No, because I started the project before I discovered attachment theory.
Got it. Okay.
Like, I didn't,
Yeah.
And so basically... I just wanted to know the process through which women start to question their sexuality.
And you had to seek out...
I had to find the women.
Women who identified at time one
I didn't want them to necessarily
lesbian?
Identify. I just said they just have to have some form of same-sex attraction. I didn't require them to identify.
Open-ended.
So basically, and the internet didn't exist. So I was like, how am I going to find these women? And Rich was like, well, they're pretty big, communities in like Syracuse and Rochester. So, and I didn't have a car. So I bought a used car for $5,000.
Wow.
A 1989 Toyota Corolla that I still have.
Stop it.
Still
runs.
Runs.
Cut it out. What are you talking about?
Oh yeah. We call it the Firebird because it's actually been on fire, but it's still running. And basically, every single weekend, I would drive to Syracuse or Rochester or Binghamton or Elmira or Freeville, and I would go to places that had coffee shops, anything where there were, gay community where I thought young women might be, and I would just physically walk up to people and be like,
"Are you shitting
I'm doing
me?
A study about..."
You just ask them about their sexuality?
Yeah. I was like, I'm doing this interview study. I had no money.
Yeah.
That's
a lot of legwork.
I'm doing this interview study,
that's not messing around.
And Judy and I, because we were a new couple, so she would actually sometimes come with me to recruit people, and she was way better at it than I was. She has no fear. She'd just walk up to people, and she'd be like, I found you like 5 more. And I'm like, what?
Angrily.
And so then I would schedule the interviews, and then I would kind of drive back and do like 10 interviews in a day. In a particular location.
Wow.
And just drive back and forth, drive back and forth, drive back and forth, drive back and forth.
Oh, my God.
And
Lisa,
it was
as a
just
grad
like
student, and you're taking classes, and you're eating
eating top
rice
ramen.
and top ramen.
I remember
whole
eating
thing.
a lot of sweet potatoes because I
Sweet
could
potatoes,
eat
'cause
them
they're nutritious,
while I
right?
was driving, and I could munch them in one hand while driving the car.
You could what? You didn't cook them?
I cooked them in the microwave, but then I would eat them like an apple.
Really?
Yeah.
Holy crap!
Just nuke them and then wrap them in tinfoil.
That's a little crazy.
Well,
I would say that's a little that crosses over the line.
It was a good portable food.
Into crazy a little bit.
Good portable food.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
So I did the interviews, and I knew I wanted to follow folks over time, but I didn't really have a clear plan on that. And so, it just sort of emerged spontaneously. But I just recently have been doing the 20-year follow-up interviews.
20 years.
20 years.
That's amazing.
And what's hilarious, and people
from
are like,
this,
"How
from
did
this
you?"
little,
and I
because
only
you
lost.
think, but I just have to process this for a second. Can I do that? I just have to because when I think about a 20-year longitudinal study, I think of a multi-center NIH.
I know.
Gigantic fucking.
But it's a small number of women.
Millions of dollars with multiple, PIs, and you're talking about
one person, no money, no funding. And I think the reason that I haven't lost folks is because it's always me.
Yeah.
I never had anybody else do the
They
interviews.
know you.
They know me.
They trust you.
What's been sort of gratifying over the years is, because I was a grad student when I started, I was close in age to a lot of the participants. And so when I call them, every couple of years, they're like, "So what's going on with you? So you have a job? Like I saw you on the web. Like, I'm so proud of you." So there's not a big power imbalance.
Yeah.
I think the way there is, because I was young and naive when I started it, and so they feel proud of me. And when I published the book, I sent them all a copy of the book.
Oh, that's nice. They're like your collaborators in a way.
Exactly.
All they have to do is be honest.
Yeah.
And so at what point do you realize that people are not being consistent in their reporting?
Well, when I asked women to talk about some of their earliest attractions, a lot of them were describing these really passionate friendships similar to the one that I had in high school with my best friend. And I would be like, "Well, were you attracted to her?" And they'd be like, "No, I really wasn't." And I was like, "Wow, because similarly, because I wasn't really aware of feeling like erotically attracted to my best friend in high school. It was the one in college.
You were just drawn.
It was like we were really we were in a romantic relationship with one another.
Yeah.
And
adolescence is so intense anyway.
Yeah.
It would be easy to
not
know exactly
that
what's
was the
going on.
first thing that struck me, was that there was something that we were all assuming that those romantic feelings always co-occurred with sexual feelings, and it was clear to me from the interviews that wasn't the case, and that's why I sought out Cindy Hazan, because I was like trying to understand this, and she introduced me to attachment theory, and I started doing all this reading. I'm like, oh, they're attachment bonds. They're just not sexual attachments.
Right.
They're more analogous to parental attachment bonds.
Right.
And so she introduced me to sort of a framework that helped me make sense of the fact that there were these romantic relationships between women that had all of the signature features of romantic attachments: the obsessive proximity seeking, the separation distress, the safe haven. They just weren't sexual. And it was, maybe a developmental thing. And that was, the big sort of aha moment.
Well, and also you're catching these young women basically still as adolescents. Right?
Yeah.
And
the
so
age range was 16 to 23.
Right. So adolescence is a time, I mean, in attachment terms, where you're really, your world is turning upside down, because
and those
you're
systems
sort of
haven't
cutting those
gotten
early
integrated
attachments.
yet. Yeah, you're
Right.
in this transitional thing where
you have to rebuild a social
rebuild it.
set of attachments, and that's terrifying.
And
right?
for
You
most,
need to latch on.
And for most adolescents, their first full-fledged attachment figure that's not their parent is a romantic partner.
Sure.
But these girls had sort of figured out a sort of transition, that their first attachment figure other than a parent was their best friend.
And
it just wasn't a sexual relationship.
I think about Eleanor Maccabee's stuff about how girls same-sex friendships, how they're sort of nicer for girls.
They're safe.
For girls especially, right? Because boys are kind of a pain in the ass. I mean, I don't want to be too generalized. And boys have their own I think, version of this.
Yeah.
But the enculturation and the way things go, they're not oriented towards
and they don't
that sort of
they don't get the same sort
behavior.
of cultural permission.
They don't. That's right. So they have their own issue there.
So I ended up designing my dissertation around female friendships to try to sort of,
that was
make
very
that,
ahead of its time.
But it was
Holy
a total
shit.
failure. It was like the worst dissertation ever, and nothing ever got published from it, and it was like a complete bust.
That's how that happens sometimes.
But so it's odd. It's like the work that I ended up publishing more and getting more known for was my master's thesis research.
Yeah.
And the dissertation just sort of, died.
I published my master's thesis, and I never, ever, ever would never publish my shitty dissertation.
And I always tell that to graduate students to sort of reassure them. I'm like, it's just another study.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the last study you do. So don't try and make it your be all end all. It may not, work out. But it was the dissertation that got me into psychophysiology because I was using really bad psychophys methods to try and sort of test the difference between romantic relationships and best friendships. So then when I get hired at Utah,
that's a good idea.
They're like, oh, well, you're you want to set up a
psychophysiologist.
psychophys lab, and yet I had never been trained in it. Like we didn't the psychophys measures that Cindy Hazan was using were basically the heart rate monitors that runners buy. It was just heart rate. There was nothing else.
They weren't so great then.
No,
they weren't so.
And so I didn't know.
Stuff.
And it was my dad who was like, you really need separate measures of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm like, oh, and I was like, wow, I'm like trying to get into this field, and yet I'm not being trained by people who know anything about it. So when I landed at Utah, it was just luck because Tim Smith was there, Bertuccino was there, and and they're like, you're going to benefit a lot from being here, and they just supported me completely. I had to set up this psychophys lab, having never actually collected valid psychophys data ever. So I just hit the books and was completely 100% self-taught on everything because I never had any training in it at all.
What kind of stuff did you start finding?
Right away, I became really interested in the emerging research on emotion regulation and the parasympathetic nervous system, the whole Porges and vagal
tone.
stuff. And so I quickly was like, wait, this all suggests that attachment security should be related to, vagal tone. And I couldn't understand why I couldn't find any research on attachment theory and psychophysiology other than like one chapter that was on like kids getting, in the strange situation. And that was, what I really wanted to do. So I ended up writing a review paper I'm like, wow, either I'm, is it possible that I'm the first person who's seeing why this is relevant? And it turned out that was sort of true. Like no one was doing it in adults. There was stuff on kids.
Right.
So I wrote this review paper that basically was a way to sort of force myself to really articulate, okay, like where am I going with this? Like if I'm going to commit to this, like I need to make sure I'm not going down a rabbit hole. So a part of it was just me boning up on it. But that sort of served as the framework for what I ended up doing, which was looking for associations between vagal tone and vagal withdrawal and attachment insecurity.
And what was the bottom line there? I mean, is it vagal? So does attachment security increase parasympathetic tone? That sort of thing?
Yeah. So individuals who are
or does it go the other way?
Individuals who are insecurely attached have lower vagal tone, which is exactly what you would expect if attachment insecurity
creates emotion regulation problems.
Is some form of regulatory deficit.
Yeah.
So that was true, and so that was the first thing I found, and then since then I've found other manifestations of that in other ways in terms of looking at couples and looking at how individuals who have lower vagal tone have different sorts of reactions to their partner's negative affect and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But all of that was on like heterosexual couples. So I was still doing the gay stuff and I was doing this attachment stuff. I basically had two different careers going on and two different sets of colleagues. But because I had a joint appointment in gender studies, it was okay. And my biggest insecurity early on at Utah was that someone was going to say to me at some point, either you're a qualitative sexuality researcher or you're a quantitative psychophysiologist who does attachment. Like, pick one.
Right.
Pick pick a direction, because right now you're all over the map. But to me, they were always deeply connected.
Someone did say that?
No, that was my fear.
That was your fear.
That was my fear.
That doesn't seem to have happened.
And I remember when I was writing my third-year statement before my third-year review, really trying to like articulate why these were both actually connected.
Figure out what the nexus is.
Yeah, and I think from that, a big part of that was the psych review piece on, on the links between attachment and sexuality.
Yeah, great.
That for
great
me
stuff.
was like, I needed to publish that to show that these were not two different lines of research.
Yeah.
They were actually connected, if I could just, explain how they were connected.
Well, and there's sort of a meta scientific aspect to this too, because by the time you're doing the psychophys attachment stuff, there's a big giant literature on attachment and a big giant literature on psychophysiology and measuring parasympathetic tone and what it's associated with in terms of self-regulatory capabilities and on and on. But there's not that much. There's not that much about sexuality and sexual identity formation, all that stuff. And one of the things that, even Popper wrote about was that you have to develop the hypotheses. You got to figure out what to look at.
I was always shocked by the fact that, because I always would attend the IARR meetings, the International Association of Relationship Research, and every other year they would be international. And I would always attend the International Academy of Sex Research, and they also alternated. And I was always shocked by the fact that I was the only person who was at both meetings. I'm like, don't the relationships people want to know about sexuality?
God, it's
and
still
don't
such
the
a problem.
sexuality people want to know about relationships? And I kept thinking, I'm sure next year I'll see some of the same people. I'm like, no, like, what's going? The fields were very segregated, and I think a part of it is a sort of a squeamishness about sexuality among the relationship researchers.
Has it gotten
Not
better?
That much
Not
better.
that much better, really.
I gave a talk at the IARR meeting in Israel called "Where's the Sex in Relationship Research?"
Yeah.
And I was saying to folks, we have these 36 item measures of conflict.
Yeah.
And then the measure of sexual satisfaction would be like, are you satisfied? Yeah. Okay. All right. That's all we need to know. And I'm like, no.
And forget psychophys. There's applied to sexuality. Oh,
nothing about like what you do, how you negotiate, your sexual practices.
But see, that's what I'm saying. That's why you need to have these more open-ended qualitative approaches, because you're gathering clues as to where to look more quantitatively, systematically down the road. You really need to build that foundation. So I want to pivot a little bit, because I really want to get back to what sexual fluidity is. What did you discover it is? And it sounds like you've been using the attachment framework to explain it a little bit, but I want to know just what is it? So
the way I would describe it, and sort of what sort of happened as I started doing follow-up interviews around every 2 years with my respondents, was I would find that their sexual identity labels kept changing, and I found that a lot of them were engaging in relationships that didn't match their pattern of attraction. So some of the women who were like, I'm 95% attracted to women, then I talked to them 2 years later, they're like, well, I started sleeping with my male best friend. And I'd be like, well, okay.
Yeah, that's a pretty big change.
What's going on there? And it was clear from talking to them that it wasn't like they were going back in the closet or they were repressed. All my respondents were really open and they were not deluded or repressed. So that standard explanation of, you're just going back into the closet, or it's false consciousness. You don't know what you want.
Sort of process.
Instead, they were like, wow, this relationship just really kind of blew my mind. And so again, I was really drawn to this notion of attachment, that there is something about specific relationships that can be so compelling that it draws women into erotic feelings that they didn't have before.
For either
gender. Direction.
Yeah.
Because I also was talking to women who I was interviewing who were like, I think I'm pretty heterosexual, but I just started sleeping with my female best friend, and I don't know where that came from. And then I would talk to them 2 years later, and they'd be like, yeah, I'm back with men. And I'd be like, so were you deluded? And they'd be like, I don't know. It was just that one woman.
That was a thing that happened. That was a thing that happened, and I did it.
It was a thing that happened.
Now, was there like confusion or shame
I was totally in
them, but
for them there was a lot of confusion, a lot of shame. I think especially for the women who had been identified as lesbian, who started relationships with men, the lesbian community was like, get out, so some of them had
coming from all directions.
Yeah, and I think that's changed a lot since then, but at that time it was really fraught for a lot of these individuals, which was part of what, as I started to do the research, became really compelling to me, because invariably the women who had those sorts of experiences felt that they were the only one. They were like, one woman actually said to me, I feel like I'm a bad example of a lesbian, so if you don't want to continue interviewing me, that's fine, because I don't want to mess up your study. And I was like, oh my God, you don't realize
this is my study.
Yeah, I'm like, you don't realize how common you actually are.
Yeah.
And so that was something that struck me right away, was that all of them seemed to think they were the only one having this sort of more fluid experience. And that I was like, oh my God, I think our whole model of what's normal and what's exceptional is reversed.
Because the fluidity was the norm.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it was relatively rare that people were all in
really,
one
really
direction
consistent.
or all in the other.
And so I was like, oh my God, we've got this completely wrong.
That's
completely
that's amazing.
upside down.
Do you know
that's
amazing?
Early on, the thing is, early on, when I was publishing the first, from the first couple rounds of follow-up data, people were like, well, you've got this weird sample and it's a small sample. And I was like, I totally get that. And they're like, you know what, you may be onto something, but it's probably not that big of a phenomenon as your sample is making it seem like.
Right.
You've got a weird sample.
Because it's what,
and
100,
so now I feel
women?
So validated, because now we have these unbelievable representative studies, the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, longitudinal studies from New Zealand, and they've all shown the same thing. And I'm like, I was right. It wasn't just my tiny, you're right. I had this tiny sample, but I was not wrong about the phenomenon.
Yeah.
And now I feel... So now when I give talks, I present all the big data, because I'm like, see, I wasn't crazy. I was not
right.
crazy.
Because especially in the current climate, it's a little bit nerve-wracking, but your sample wasn't that small.
Well,
it was what, over 100?
I started with 100
with
women.
With a decade of,
well,
2
that
decades
is a small,
now.
and it's like, completely snowball sample. So I mean,
sure.
I totally get that, but I also feel that there is a role for small sample research, and I feel
absolutely.
My study is an example of the fact that you need that sort of work for hypothesis generation.
Yes.
And you need it to be able to figure out what questions to ask. So certainly, I never expected it to be the last word on anything, but the only way to get some of the information that we need is through that more intensive small sample work.
Yeah.
And, that has no funding, and that is cheap to do, and that you just kind of pull it out of your out of your hat.
And is there any evidence that there are sex differences in this? And I mean,
initially I really thought there were. Initially, I was like, this is like a female phenomenon, but I think largely I'm starting to doubt that, because I've started collecting data from men, and they're showing some of the same kind of variability that I used to think was more common in women. So I kind of feel like the jury's out on that. I used to think that women were way more fluid than men.
That women are more.
Yeah, and I was a part of that common story. I was one of the people, making that argument.
And that men, and there's more of a genetic component in males.
It might be that there is, more fluidity in women than men, but I think the size of that gender difference is an open empirical question.
Yeah. That's just amazing stuff.
I mean, women have had more cultural permission to dabble in same-sex sexuality than men have. And so that gives them more opportunities to sort of figure out.
But what about the historical record? I mean, I've heard, for example, of, ancient Greek culture being the opposite.
Yeah,
I don't know whether there's anything. I don't know what. I mean, I literally no idea what the evidence is for any of those claims.
I think a lot of that just shows that sexuality.
The Iliad or something.
I mean, other cultures, it's only the contemporary West that has linked same-sex behavior and attraction rigidly to an idea of a fixed orientation.
Yeah.
You find same-sex sexuality in every culture that you look at, but it coexists with normal heterosexual behavior. And so it's only relatively recently that we think about it as a trait of a person.
Right.
And so how they explain it is kind of up to every culture. Is it just men being horny? Is it a form of male friendship, which was true in a lot of cultures? So you find different versions of it, across history and across different cultures. And, in some cultures, for example, the penetrating male, the active partner, is not considered gay. It's only the passive partner who is considered gay. So it's like, you can engage in as much same-sex behavior as you want. As long as you are the penetrator, that's a totally heterosexual male role.
Well, and there's it seems to me that there's also ample space for other sort of sexual behaviors that are not, fully penetration, right?
Yeah.
I remember reading one of the surprising things
and of course, Bill Clinton would say they're not sex. So,
I remember reading Christopher Hitchens' autobiography. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah.
And I mean, Christopher Hitchens, this sort of like chest pounding neocon guy, and he there's all kinds of stuff in there about engaging in sexual behavior with boys, all through his adolescence, and describing that this was utterly normative, at least in his recollection. This was not. And
a lot of folks think of like, the boarding school circle jerks and stuff like that.
Right.
So I think that there's a lot of space for individuals to interpret attractions and behaviors in a lot of different ways, depending on the context.
Yeah.
And we are relatively unique as a culture in that we take any sign of same-sex sexuality and we say, that must be an indicator of something permanent about you.
Yeah.
And the truth is that sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't.
And maybe the truth is that often it isn't.
Yeah.
Often it's just, but
sexuality is a pretty flexible system. Think about, the people, you always hear about people being like, well, I can't reach orgasm unless I think about some particular thing. And it'll be something kind of crazy. And we're like, wow, obviously sexuality is a pretty flexible system. That you've learned something at some point that gets integrated into your mind.
Yeah.
And, so clearly cognition and exposure play a role in helping to set sexual trajectories.
Yeah.
So why are we so surprised, by that amount of fluidity? It's like clearly we're not, like the animals that literally cannot mate unless they are, ovulating.
Right.
We are a pretty complicated species.
I was saying to someone, maybe Eli, a little while ago, that if you try to find real unequivocal generalizations about human behavior, it's just really fucking hard to do. You can't. The rule for humans is flexibility.
Yeah, because that's what's adaptive because of our large brains and because we lived in diverse environments.
We created this capability over phylogeny to flexibly adapt to all kinds of conditions, and that means that not only sexuality but broad mating like monogamy, all of these other things that we sort of on one camp or another, we want to say is a fixed trait.
It's also true with stress sensitivity, which I think is so interesting, that all this research showing that exposure to early adversity can render children sort of set the development of their stress response systems to be hypersensitive. And that hypersensitivity is adaptive, right? Because if you are living in a dangerous environment, you need to be hypervigilant.
Yeah.
And that hypervigilance actually makes them more sort of absorbent of good environments as well as bad.
Yeah.
So we as a species have evolved mechanisms to take in what kind of environment am I in? And the body changes. It's not just a behavioral change. There are physiological changes that occur, and that's what I find so fascinating.
I guess I have really one more thing I really wanted to ask you, which is, given this almost dizzying array of flexibility, fluidity, of difficulty typologizing individuals, where does that leave us politically?
Well, it's interesting. That's part of what I'm going to talk about. I think that the gay community has made a huge mistake in using the fixedness of sexual orientation as the grounds for civil rights by saying, we're born this way, so it's not our fault, and please love and accept us. That, first of all, is just scientifically wrong. There are definitely biological contributions, but they're not deterministic.
Right. Like anything that
I know. It's
influence.
like any geneticist is like, that's a stupid thing to say about anything. But it's like the way science gets popularized.
Right. For political reasons.
For political reasons. So it's just wrong. And there's enough data on change now to show that it's just completely whacked. B, it's actually
You're going to catch hell for that.
I don't. That's the point. Like, I feel like at this point in my career, I need to, like, I always joke with my partner. I'm like, I've job security. I'm like, I need to use my power for good and not evil. So if anyone's going to catch hell for it, I'm safe. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Throw it.
Good.
So
good.
B, it's wrong. B, it's actually unnecessary. I partnered up with a brilliant colleague of mine in the law school at the University of Utah, Cliff Roski, who does work on sort of the LGBT legal stuff. And if you actually look at the decisions, the immutability of sexual orientation has not actually been a factor in all the legal victories. We think it is, but it's actually not. So we think that it's helping us, and it actually hasn't been that important because there are so many other grounds on which those decisions have been made, and it wasn't a factor in the most recent Supreme Court victory. Usually, it's the fact that animus against any particular group is not constitutional. So if regardless of whether it's immutable or not, if a law appears to be motivated by animus, it's just wrong. And that was the basis for the Lawrence versus Kansas decision.
Good point.
Also, laws against LGBT discrimination are often founded on the sex discrimination history. It ends up being a form of sex discrimination to discriminate against, like, same-sex marriage. Immutability, and in terms of the equal protection statutes, immutability is one of the list of things that folks that the Supreme Court can consider in whether or not a law is constitutional, but it's not the only one. History of discrimination is another one. So it's again, it's like it hasn't been, it's one of several things that can be considered. Another is that courts have changed their definition of immutability from a trait that cannot change to a trait that is so central to a person's sense of self that it would be wrong to make them change it. So even the definition of immutability from the court's perspective is not what most of us think it is. So for all these reasons, we've just been on the wrong road. And then the final thing, which for me is the most important take-home message, is that it is simply unjust to the entirety of the queer community to make the fixedness of your same-sex sexuality a condition for your rights. Because it marginalizes bisexual individuals. And
it'll wind up doing
more
damage again.
The kind of women in my study who had one same-sex relationship, that there shouldn't be some litmus test for rights where it's like, well, if you're a stable lesbian, you're allowed to be protected by the laws. But if you're someone who had just one same-sex relationship,
confused,
you don't deserve your rights. It sets up a hierarchy of, queerness. And, there was basically any civil rights strategy needs to protect the entire population. And so this notion that fixed patterns of sexual orientation are worthy of respect and others are not, it's just antithetical to any sort of movement for self-respect. So that the correct answer to, like, are people born this way or are they not? That's an interesting scientific question. Like, it's one of my interesting scientific questions, but it has no role in public policy debates. It's like a so what? It's like, it doesn't matter how you got to be either we're a society that protects the privacy of individuals to determine their intimate lives or we're not. No one ever asked during Loving versus Virginia, are some people born like attracted to people of the other race? No one cares why you want to marry someone of another race. Do you have the right to make your own marriage choice or do you not? We don't care why. Like, are some people born loving black people? I mean, like, that would be a ridiculous question. No one would ever think to ask that question.
These people are in love now. Is the only question.
How you got there is an interesting scientific question, but it absolutely should have no role in the public policy debate at all. And so I feel like part of my mission now is to try and make that point because I'm so tired of seeing the science be bastardized. I mean, it's amazing. Even on the the website for the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is like this famously progressive.
Yeah, sure.
They're like, if homosexuality is genetic, as most scientists believe it is, then discrimination again. And I'm like, okay, that statement, if homosexuality is genetic, as most scientists believe, I'm like, do you even understand how heritability works? And yes, there's a genetic contribution, but the heritability of sexual orientation is actually lower than the heritability of smoking. And it's lower than the heritability of job satisfaction.
Okay, both of those things surprise me a lot.
And you will not open up any magazine and see a picture
here
of a baby and say, is this child born unsatisfied with their job? The heritability of sexual orientation is around 35%.
Wow.
So, yes, that is significantly greater than zero. That is a statistically significant, contribution, but it's obviously not deterministic. And we can't make that a precondition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lisa, it's so great to talk to you. Thank you for doing this with me.
This was fun.
Was it fun?
Yeah.
Oh, good. All right.
I look forward to hearing the rest of these.
Thanks.
I want to hear Eli's.
Yeah, I'll play it for you. Okay.
Fun.
Always find that sweet spot in your heart. Will always be.
Okay, that's it. That's all I got. Thanks to Lisa Diamond for being so forthcoming and candid. I could have done that. I could have kept going for a lot longer, but I didn't want to push my luck. And I hope in any case that Lisa enjoyed it as much as I did, and hopefully as much as you did. Folks, the music on Circle of Willis is written by Tom Stouffer and Gene Rulli and performed by their band, The New Drakes. For information about how to purchase their music, check out the About page at circleofwillispodcast.com. Don't forget that Circle of Willis is brought to you by VQR and the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia, and that the Circle of Willis is a member of the TEJ FM network. You can find out more about them, that network, those guys, at teej.fm. And let me say, if you like this podcast, why not give us a little review at iTunes and let us know how we're doing? It's easy. Just do that. I'll see you all again at episode 4, where I talk with Will Cunningham of the University of Toronto about becoming one of the world's preeminent neuroscientists and about the aesthetics of data analysis, believe it or not, among many other things. Until that time, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.